Hi, welcome to this video where we're looking at writing a client report. What we're going to do is talk about a general report. This could be for a strategy project, it could be for any sort of consultancy project, uh, pretty much any sort of project where you're doing something for a client. I think this type of report would be relevant to that. So let's just remember or state some basic key factors when we're thinking about writing reports. So I think one of the most important things with any sort of report is you need to have a clear message. We're asking somebody to read something that we've written, and the fact of the matter is that nobody really likes reading reports. Probably whoever's going to be reading it is trying to fit it into their day, and so they really want you to be effective in terms of to communicate, and they really want you to be efficient in terms of their time and therefore your use of pages. So most people, when they pick up a report, are really hoping that the person who has written it um, has been efficient and effective. So pay attention to your narrative. So don't just blather on, don't just give lots of information. Try and say what it is that you're trying to say. Um, Most reports will contain quite a lot of information, and so it makes it a lot better for the reader if you can produce a very clear structure, so that the reader can sort of know where they are in the report and they know what's coming up next, and so they can feel comfortable and orientated within the report, and they can follow the logic that you're trying to develop. And you can also help the reader by reminding the reader as you go through the report, where they are and what the narrative is. In terms of style and language, obviously that's a very subjective thing, and different organisations will have different requirements. So if you're writing a report for a very high level organisation or group of people, then obviously you're going to be trying to adopt a very careful and high level narrative. And obviously, different businesses are different. Some businesses quite like quite an informal, direct approach. Some even appreciate a little bit of humour around the narrative, but some clients, really do require it to be very formal. So obviously, the key thing there is don't guess, don't make assumptions. Check with your client. Um, it's a good idea to use visuals within a report. So that could be charts, it could be photographs, it could be tables, but don't put them in just because you've got them. Make sure they're adding value to your narrative. Now, a report is often a formal record of a consulting project, and so therefore it has to contain certain things. Sometimes you've performed analysis or you've collected data. That data needs to be in the report because you need to create a formal record of that. But you don't want to have all of that stuff crammed into the main body of the report. So use appendices to get inessential material out of the main body and out of the way, so that you can create a nice, efficient, and effective narrative. Okay, so what about the basic structure? Well, this would be my sort of general structure for a client report. The first thing is an executive summary. That's really useful, and you need to remember that if you're writing an executive summary, it's a summary. It's amazing how many reports I see from people who really should know better, that they've not actually summarised the whole of the report. They've just presented an introduction to it. Then, once you've done the executive summary, which I'll talk about a little bit more later, we're into the main body of the report, which I would structure in terms of introduction. So that basically orientates the reader, tells the reader what the report is, what the project was trying to do, and what the content is. Then the methodology, that tells the reader how you've gone about the project, because that's important for the reader to be able to evaluate what they're seeing and appreciate where that information is coming from. And then your analysis, which is often the main sort of aspect of the project. So you're really trying to present your analysis to the reader, show them the logic of the analysis. And then finally, recommendations. So normally in a project there's some form of recommendation. It could be that you're actually providing advice to the client as to what to do. It could just simply be that you've performed some analysis and you're trying to present the summary of that analysis back to the client. But whatever it is, you need to say what this analysis means for the client. And then finally, you've got the appendices, which is where essentially you put all of the technical material, all of the data, all of the tables, so that it's out of the way, so somebody can look at those if they want to, but otherwise, they can get on with reading the main body, and that's it. Okay, so the main thing is we want that structure to be as simple and as easy to navigate as possible. We're not trying to sort of be clever. We're not trying to impress the client with how complicated we can be. We want to make it nice and easy and get the information across as painlessly as possible. When you're writing that report, therefore, you need to be aware of 3 different types of readers. Okay, so reader 1, which traditionally would be senior managers, and traditionally they might only read the executive summary. Okay, so they may pick up the report, read the executive summary, and that's it. So these might be very senior managers or other managers which are interested in the project but don't want to read the whole report. Reader 2 would be your main client or clients and key stakeholders of the project, and we would expect them to read the executive summary but also the main body. But we wouldn't expect them to go through the appendices in detail. They might look at 1 or 2 appendices, but in general they're going to leave the appendices for somebody else. And then reader 3, which would be technical staff, and so they would be the people that have to check that all of the analysis and all of the data is actually reliable and that the findings make sense. So they're going to have to go through all of the report, including the appendices, to make sure everything is in order. So each of these aspects of your report must read as a complete whole. Okay, so I must be able to pick up the executive summary, read it, and know everything that I need to know without going any further. Okay, so all of these readers want to get a complete picture of the project. It's just that reader 1 wants it very concise, reader 2 wants it's a bit more concise, and reader 3 is the person that has to check everything. So let's just say a little bit more about each of those elements. So the executive summary. Now this is frequently a problem, both for students writing reports, but also for consultants writing report and even academics who should know better often fall down with this. The key point is it needs to be an overview of the whole report. It's not an introduction. Okay, you need to summarize everything that's in the report. So there needs to be an introduction, there needs to be a methodology, there needs to be analysis, and there needs to be recommendations in the executive summary. Now it needs to be about 1 page long, and it needs to be visually attractive. Okay, so normally we use larger margins, we might use a different type font, we might change the font size as well, just to make it something that looks attractive, inviting for somebody to read. Now the common mistakes are that it provides an introduction only. Okay, it doesn't summarize the report. Secondly, it fails to cover findings and recommendations. Okay, it says what's in the report but doesn't actually summarize the findings and recommendations. It gets too long. Okay, so if we're going over one page, already people are thinking, it looks too long. And the final thing is there's no clear message. Okay, so there's just some information there, but there's no fundamental narrative that you're trying to say to the reader. So remember, the people who read the executive summary could be the most important people to your project. So you really need to spend a bit of time on the executive summary and make sure that it is effective. Now, the introduction should be relatively straightforward. The main point is to orientate the reader, and you do that by giving a brief overview of the context of the project, so a little bit of background, a little bit of an explanation about what the project context was, and don't assume that the reader has read the executive summary, so there might be some repetition here, and that's absolutely fine. Make the purpose of the project clear to the reader. So readers like to know, so what was it that you actually were doing that this report is actually talking about? And then explain the content of the report to orientate the reader. So readers like to know, right, there's 4 sections. The first section is going to do this, the second section is going to do this, the third section is going to do this, so they can go, okay, that all makes sense. And if you're going to explain the content, make sure that you give a little bit of logic as well, so they understand, why you've structured it in that way. So at the end of the introduction, the reader should be going, right, okay, I know roughly what this is about. I know what they were trying to do, and I understand the basic shape of the report. And then they feel much more comfortable going into the actual sort of reading of the report. Now, the next section is methodology. This is basically a clear explanation of how you did the project. Okay, nothing complicated, just a simple, step by step, 1, 2, 3, 4, or A, B, C, D. So present this as a clear, logical process. Okay, so boom, 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 boom. Now, the reality is, in practice, that there will have been deviations to this. So, when you do a project, often it's a bit iterative. So you do something and then you weren't quite sure about something, so you go back to the client, you change something, you go back. Maybe you can't find something, or that data isn't available, so you go back. Or you learn something that changes your mind, you go back to the client and say, look, we've done this initial analysis and that's changed our mind a bit about what we should do next. Okay, so in practice, the methodology is often a bit messy. But when you write the project report, you don't have to give a full narrative of what actually happened. So the reader doesn't want to know that you did this and then you changed your mind and went back and did that, blah, 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 blah. Just present a nice, simple, sort of idealized version of what the project was, so that the reader can follow what you're actually trying to present. They don't need to know the full historic narrative. Provide a simple chart like the one in the diagram there, which shows each step of the project, but make sure that if you're going to do that you can interpret what those boxes mean. Okay, so don't just have a box with just a single word in it. You think, well, what's that? Give a bit of description so it makes sense. But I like to see a little process diagram like the one in the box there. Now, the next section will be the analysis. So this is where you present the actual analysis that you've undertaken. So this is really the main sort of contribution that you're making, that the client has paid you for or has asked you to do. So use a simple structure to present your analysis. I tend to use the steps which have been explained in the previous section. Okay, so if I say the methodology is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, then I present the analysis as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It just keeps things nice and simple. Explain the logic of each step as you present it. Okay, so don't assume the reader understands the meaning of each analysis. Show the findings. So explain it without going into massive detail. Explain it, because you can't assume that the reader understands everything that you're saying. So if you're doing a rich picture or a business model canvas, say a little bit about a business model canvas, what it is, how it works, short, concise, just in case, the reader, because remember that a client report will be passed around a range of readers, and not everybody will know what a business model canvas is. So give a little bit of explanation, but basically you're trying to show your findings. Provide a clear narrative of steps and the overall process. So don't just explain the steps. Try and create a narrative which strings the steps together as you present that, so the reader feels like that they're understanding what was done. Use appendices to keep the main body relatively easy to follow. So don't put all of your findings in the main body. Just pick a selection. So it's okay to have a few charts and pictures and diagrams, but you don't want too many. And you want, you don't want to sort of turn the page over and see loads of charts, because it's like, oh, do I have to read all that? So pick some to help you with the narrative, but put everything else, in appendices. And when you're creating appendices, don't just chuck everything in there. Remember that somebody is going to have to go through those appendices and check that they're okay. So I try and put one appendix per page, so that when someone goes, blah, 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 see Appendix A, there's always a bit of trepidation when you go, should I look at the appendix? Because sometimes people just make them very, very difficult to read. But, so you see Appendix A, if you go there and Appendix A is there, it's on one page, people go, oh, that's that, I can read that. So they'll read it. Whereas if you go there and it's like 10 pages of dense sort of mathematics or big data tables, you go, oh, can't be bothered to read that. So try and keep your appendices also nice and attractive to look at. The final section will be your recommendations. So this is where you discuss the findings from your analysis. Now that might not be needed, but normally there's some discussion is required, because especially if you're doing strategic analysis or complex projects, there probably isn't an absolute definite answer to what you've been doing. So present clear recommendations as agreed with the client. So you should be checking your recommendations with your client before you actually start writing this section, or you should be writing a draft version and showing your client, so that the client can say, oh yeah, I'm happy with all that. Because you need to remember that the client may be a little bit sensitive to what goes into that final report. Your client is probably some kind of a manager within the business, but they might not be the CEO, and this report might be going to the CEO and other senior team members. So your client's probably quite careful and cautious about what actually goes in the recommendations, and they might be keen to make sure that the narrative and the message is appropriate within within their own mind. So, and also you need to bear in mind that readers may jump straight to this section in practice. So it's not unusual when you give people a report that they jump straight to the recommendations to see what the report's saying. And that can be, again, sometimes your client might want to be a little bit cautious about that, because if the recommendations are quite radical or quite controversial, then again, the client will be like, well, we need to just be a little bit careful about how we present that. Now, just a few words about diagrams and charts. So people like well organized and well presented charts, but they must be fully annotated, titled with axes and data points clearly labeled. Okay, it's very frustrating if you see a chart in a report and you can't interpret it. It should be self-contained and understandable without the text, so you're trying to make it nice and presentable. Make sure they add value. Don't just throw them in because you can do it. Not too many, and be careful, they may set people off. Okay, so again, you don't want to put a table in which is going to be controversial. So again, you should be talking to your client just to make sure that they're happy with the data presented in a certain way. So there's an example of a chart which I think is very, very easy to understand. There's a clear title, it's clearly labeled, it all makes perfect sense. You can pretty much understand that, within a few seconds. Now, tables, people don't like tables very much. They're not attractive, they're not nice to interpret. They may be essential, but leave them out if they aren't essential. Split them into digestible portions. So, cut your tables up and make them smaller and easier to read. Titles, notes, labels are as important as with diagrams and charts. They should be pretty much understandable without the text. So you should be able to look at them and say, yeah, that makes sense. If you have to put in a load of data into the report, stick them in appendices if you can, because they just clutter up the main body and slow the reader down. Now, pictures are a good idea for a report. People like pictures. You can use pictures to give the right sort of tone for your report. You might sort of have pictures of people. You might have pictures of property or elements of the project. For example, here's a picture from a workshop that I ran a few years ago. I think it's really, really nice to show pictures of things that actually happened in the project. It kind of makes people feel that the project really existed, that people were involved. We're not sort of telling fibs when we say we had workshops and people contributed. It also reminds people that they took part, and it reminds people what happened in the workshops. And people like to see pictures of themselves, and it brings the report alive for them. And you can also use pictures to make a point. Maybe in a sort of jokey way, and that can be appropriate, but you need to be careful with that. But sometimes a picture can really sort of introduce the main point of a section, and again, it draws people in. So, just a few common mistakes before we finish. So, misreading client expectations. So, wrong tone, wrong style, wrong content, wrong language, and you've got your main message wrong. So, basically don't assume you know what the client wants. You need to always make sure that you discuss the report with the client, show the client a draft of the report so that there are no surprises when it actually comes to the final report. Another mistake, no clear message, just lots of information. So I call this the bucket approach. So the idea is you've got a bucket and you've just thrown everything into it. So it's like your report is a bucket and you've just chucked everything, just thrown it all in there and said, right, there you go. You can sort of make sense of that. Nobody likes that. People want the report to be, carefully presented so that it's easy to read, straightforward. A really good report should be quick and easy to read. Poor executive summary. It's just an introduction. Now, I've talked about that earlier. Poor introduction. Okay, so it's not setting the scene. It's not clarifying the context and the purpose of the project. So the reader's not quite sure what it is that they're looking at. Hard to read main body. Okay, so maybe the structure's not very well organized and there's no explanation of the structure. Maybe there's no signposting. So the narrative is just not clear. So the reader's reading through thinking, I'm not really sure where this is going. Language inappropriate to the client organization. So maybe you're being a little bit too formal, or maybe you're being a little bit too technical. Maybe you're being a little bit too informal. You need to make sure that you get that right. Too much technical content in the main body. So obviously I do business analytics as well as strategy. And obviously we need to be really careful when we write sort of analytics reports that we don't have too much mathematics in there. But also with strategy, if you sort of go on and on about the technical side of strategy and you go on about business model canvases and strategy canvases and blah, 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 your average sort of reader might start thinking, oh, this is just too technical for me. Hard to read appendices. So, you know, basically your appendices are so hard to read that nobody can be bothered to read them, and that's a problem. Not for obviously people who are not going to read it, but you know, somebody, you know, there may be some technical person that has to go through that and check everything's right, and then your report could be bounced back to you and say, look, we can't understand these appendices. And then finally, the report is too long. Okay, so obviously, you know, there's a tendency to want, you know, if you want to give value for money to your client, then you want to give them a nice, you know, thick report. But actually, people don't want thick reports in general because, you know, everybody's busy. Nobody wants to be spending hours and hours reading reports. It's nobody's, you know, idea of good fun. So, you know, keep your reports short and punchy and effective and easy to read, unless, you know, you're essentially creating some kind of evidence base, which means that you've got to put a lot of detail in that report. Okay, so that's all I want to say on reports. You know, the main thing is to remember that, you know, somebody is going to have to open up that report and read it, and you're trying to make things as easy as possible and as attractive as possible for that person. Okay, thanks a lot.